One adult leaves the house, earns nearly all of the family's money, and comes home to a place that produces almost nothing for sale. That setup is younger than most people assume. It spread through the 1800s and peaked for a few decades in the middle of the last century. Before that, in most families, the earning and the housework happened in the same building, and more than one person in the house was usually doing both. This lands on you because the money half of that arrangement is still sitting on your side of the table. Dinner, the ring, the deposit on a bigger place once there's a baby, the 20,000 for a wedding everyone expects you to pay for. It all arrives with the same silent explanation underneath. This is what men do. This is what men have always done. That always only goes back a few generations, and most of what held it up is gone. For most of history, the place a family lived was also the place it produced a lot of what it used and sold, and several people in the house had a hand in that. Factories pulled a big share of that production out of the home and put it behind a gate, with a wage attached to whoever walked through. Once the money was earned somewhere else, it became possible, and then normal in many places, for one adult to go get it, while the other stayed with a home that made less and less. Then washing machines, supermarkets, freezers, and full school days stripped out most of the work that was left at home. The money side of that deal is still being collected from you. The production side of it mostly ended around 50 years ago. In a Yorkshire village in the 1640s, the loom takes up most of the main room. The husband works it. The wife and the older children card and spin the wool that feeds it, and the small ones carry bobbins until they're big enough for something harder. The cloth that goes to the market town on Friday has 5 people's hands in it. Watch how the money moves, because that says more than the loom does. A clothier drops raw wool at the door, collects finished cloth, and pays by the piece for what the household made together. The payment lands on the house rather than on a person. There's no single wage in that room, so there's no single earner in it either. 300 years earlier, much of the ale drunk in English villages was brewed by women in their own kitchens and sold out the front door. A pole shoved out over the street said a fresh batch was ready. Ale spoiled within days, so most villages needed a steady local supply, which meant most villages had women in business. The husband's field work was one income line. The ale money came back through the same doorway the ale went out of. Foreign visitors to Holland in the 1600s kept writing home about the same thing, half admiring and half scandalized. Dutch wives kept the books, ran shop counters, signed for goods, and argued with merchants in the street. Englishmen found it strange enough to put in letters, and in Amsterdam it was ordinary. The wife was a working partner in a business that lived on the ground floor of the house she slept above. In Yoruba towns in what is now Nigeria, market trade was largely women's work, and a married woman often kept her own capital, her own stock, and her own profits, and was expected to feed her children out of what she made. Think about the last big thing you paid for on your own, the car repair, the deposit, the flight for both of you. When you handed the money over, did any part of you check whether that was actually your job? Or did it just feel like the shape of the world? Guild towns in Germany and France had a rule that gives the whole thing away. When a master baker or a master tailor died, his widow could often keep the shop running under his license, sometimes for years. A town doesn't hand a working business to somebody who has never done the work. She got the shop because the people on that street had watched her do a large part of it for 20 years. That one held me up for a while. The records rarely bother explaining why the widow could be trusted with the trade. It was too obvious to be worth the ink. In farming villages in Japan in the early 1800s, the silkworms lived on the upper floor of the house. The women fed them, watched the temperature through the night, and sold the cocoons. In a good year, the silk brought in more cash than the rice did, while the men worked the paddies below. 2 products, 1 roof, and the household was the business rather than the place the business paid for. On a Nebraska homestead in the 1870s, the chickens and the butter were often the only cash a family saw between harvests. Egg money bought the boots, the coffee, the nails, and the doctor when he came. Harvest money arrived once a year if the weather cooperated. The steady cash came from the wife's end of the yard. Then a big share of the work walked out of the house. Around 1800 in Lancashire, spinning that had been done in cottages moved into buildings with water wheels and then steam engines, because a machine that size needs a river and a floor that can hold it. The wool and the cotton stopped coming to the family. The family started walking to the wool. For the first 50 years, it was rarely just the men who went. Mill floors were full of women and girls because those machines rewarded small hands and steady attention more than shoulders did. A Manchester family in 1830 might have a wife and 3 children earning, with the father bringing in less than the 2 oldest. Nobody designed that. It fell out of what the machinery happened to need. The provider role men know today starts here. Working men's organizations began demanding a wage big enough that a man's wife wouldn't have to enter the mill at all. They called it the family wage, and they fought for it for decades, for reasons that were part decent and part self-interested. The mills were dangerous, and the hours were inhuman. Employers could also use women's lower-paid labor to hold wages down, and the men knew it. That demand only makes sense in a world where the earning happens somewhere else. A weaver in 1500 couldn't have asked for a wage that kept his wife out of the workplace. The workplace was his front room, and she was already working in it. Men had carried a household more or less alone before. Widowers, soldiers' families, men whose wives were sick. And it was understood as hardship. What the family wage helped do was turn that hardship into a target, and then into a standard. A home that sells little, and one adult bringing in nearly all of the cash. From there, it spread the way an arrangement spreads once money is behind it. Census takers increasingly wrote housewife in the occupation column for women doing much of what their grandmothers had done for pay. Early pension and benefit schemes were built around one male earner with dependents attached, so the forms themselves started treating that household as the normal one. Advertising did the rest, selling appliances to a woman whose job was now defined as the house. Within 2 generations, something argued for in a wage dispute was being described as the natural order. There's a word that carries the whole story inside it. Economy comes from a Greek term for household management, oikonomia. For a couple of thousand years, thinking about wealth meant thinking about how to run a house, because the house was where a great deal of wealth got made. Grain, animals, tools, cloth, beer, and the people working on all of it. When production moved onto a factory floor, the house kept the word and lost most of the job. The version most men picture when they say traditional arrived well after the family wage fight started. Roughly the 1920s through the 1970s, peaking in the 20 years after the Second War, one wage covered a house, a car, and a wife at home with the children. It was real, and plenty of men alive today watched their grandfathers do it. It was also the first stretch on record when a large share of ordinary households ran on a single earner, and in most places it lasted about as long as one working life. It never covered everybody, even at its peak. Black households in American cities rarely had it. Farm families mostly didn't. Immigrant families in the tenements didn't. The wife took in laundry, took in boarders, and did piecework at the kitchen table with the children helping. The single-earner house was largely a middle-class arrangement in rich countries during the biggest wage boom the world has ever had. One slice does break the run, and it's worth being exact about it. In most centuries, there was a thin layer at the top. Gentry, big merchants, professional families, where a wife's day went on directing servants and paying calls rather than producing goods. That existed. It was also small, and it worked as a status display largely because the wives further down were producing something. Showing that your wife didn't have to work was a way of showing money. That's a strange origin for something men now get handed as a duty. There's a good objection to all of this, and it's worth answering. Someone would say I picked poor households on purpose. Peasants, weavers, market traders, of course they all worked, they were broke, and being broke is a condition rather than a tradition. Give people money, and they arrange themselves the natural way. He'd add that men bringing home food goes back further than any of these records, back to the hunt, and no ledger out of Yorkshire touches that. Take that seriously, then look again at those households. 5 centuries, 4 continents. Different religions, different laws, different climates, farms and guild towns and trading ports, and a wide spread of wealth between them. If the arrangement ran on poverty, changing the wealth should change the arrangement. The wealth changes a great deal across those households, and the setup mostly holds. The reason it keeps coming out similar is boring and physical. Before engines, most of what a family used was made where the family lived. The bread, the cloth, the beer, the candles, the tools, the animals. Production sat inside the walls. A man couldn't leave for work in the way we mean it now, because there was nowhere much to leave for. A household where one adult brings in nearly all the money needs 2 things: a wage paid at a distance and a home that sells almost nothing. Both became common in the same century, pushed by the same engines. The hunt doesn't rescue it either. Men in foraging groups brought meat, and meat mattered enormously. Women brought roots, nuts, fruit and small game, and in a number of the groups anthropologists have measured, that was the larger share of everyday calories. The balance varied a lot between societies. Some leaned heavily on hunting, others barely at all. What generally holds across them is that more than one adult was producing what the group ate. None of this means the work was shared evenly. It was divided by sex in most of those houses, and often sharply. Men did the ploughing, the heavy trades, the fighting. Women did the dairy, the brewing, the cloth, the garden, the stall, and the children. That division is genuinely old, and nobody is erasing it. What changed in the 1800s was the location and the concentration. Earning moved out of the house, and one of the 2 adults walked out after it, with nearly all of the household's cash income riding on him. The ground kept moving after that. In 1974, American law stopped lenders from discounting or ignoring a wife's income on a mortgage application. 2 incomes could now be counted toward one house. Credit, planning rules, and a shortage of building all pushed prices too. So this wasn't the only lever. What it did was raise the ceiling on what a couple could borrow. And in a market where couples bid against each other, prices climbed toward the ceiling. Within a generation, the arrangement men are still measured against had drifted out of reach for a lot of the men being measured. Other things moved the same way. Pay for the median man in the West has grown slowly since the 70s, while housing ran ahead of it. Women have earned the majority of bachelor's degrees in the United States every year since the early 1980s. In a large share of couples now, she brings in as much as he does, or more. The economy that produced the sole provider spent the last 50 years taking him apart, and nobody voted on it. The ring shows how thin some of this is. Engagement rings go back centuries. The idea that the right amount to spend is a month of your salary, and later 2 months, was pushed hard by diamond advertising in the middle of the last century. The same campaign that gave us the line about diamonds being forever in 1947. A sales benchmark got attached to your paycheck, it stuck, and men now quote it to each other as a rule they've failed to meet. I watched a man reach for the check at a table a few feet from me before the plates were cleared, sitting across from a woman I happened to know, out-earned him by a wide margin. Neither of them said anything about it. His hand moved before he did. Count what still sits on your side by default. The first few dinners, the proposal, the honeymoon, the next car when one of you needs one. You carry the bigger share of the deposit because you earn more, and often the whole deposit if you don't. If the two of you split with a child involved, most support formulas look at both incomes. And if yours is the bigger one, the payment comes out of it, on a schedule built around a household that stopped being the norm before you were born. The pressure has faces on it, and you know all of them. Her father asks what you do for a living, and doesn't ask her the same question. The profile line says she's looking for a man with his life together, written by a woman with a job and a lease. Your own friends go quiet for half a second when you mention that she paid for the trip. When was the last time anybody asked her what she brings in? Out loud, in numbers, in front of people, the way it tends to get asked of you before the second date is over. The 1950s version was a trade, and a real one. He handed over most of the wage. She ran a production job that could swallow 50 hours a week. No dishwasher, no dryer, no freezer worth the name, bread and clothes and repairs done at home. 3 or 4 children, often an old parent in the back bedroom. That household still made things. Far less than the weaver's housemaid, and enough that what she produced was visibly the other half of the deal. That half shrank, and machines are most of the reason. A washing machine, a freezer, a supermarket, and a full school day turned a 50-hour job into a much smaller one. Household production dropped hard on one side of the deal. The money expectation on the other side barely moved. One half of a 100-year-old bargain is still being collected from you, and the other half thinned out around the time your parents met, with no notice sent to anyone. You're being held to the man's side of an arrangement whose other side mostly ended 50 years ago, and the whole thing was put together inside the last 2 centuries. You still owe a household something. A man who puts nothing into one isn't a partner in it, and that part doesn't change with the century. What isn't fixed is the size and shape of what you carry. That part is a leftover from an economy that ran on one factory wage, kept alive by people who've forgotten it was ever new. Contribution matters. Which sex is expected to carry the money is not a law of nature. When a bill lands on your side by default, the rent split that isn't really a split, say the arrangement out loud before you pay it. Ask what the other side looks like, in the same kind of numbers you're being asked for. Ask it the way you'd ask a business partner, because for most of human history, a household was also a working business. There's a good answer available, and plenty of women give it without blinking. She earns, and it goes into one pot on the same terms as yours. Or she carries something real that you'd otherwise be paying somebody else to do. Those are the kinds of households that can work, whether you're talking about the 1640s or today. It goes wrong when the terms never get said out loud. When a man assumes the bill he's holding is ancient, and it turns out to be about as old as his grandfather's first job.